The last thing they took from her was her name. Before that, her hair, her clothes, her voice. She was 14 when the cart stopped at the southern gate of the Forbidden City. But the girl who stepped down was no longer anyone's daughter, no longer someone's future. She didn't look up. No one told her to bow. Yet she did anyway. The towering red gate above her loomed like a wound carved into the stone wall. Its iron bolts glinted in the morning haze on either side. Stone lions crouched with their jaws half open, as if mid-snarl. She could feel their gaze settle into her bones. 26 girls stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder. Some were younger, none older. Not one spoke. Their robes were stained from the journey. Their lips were chapped. Their eyes were hollow. Behind them, the cart driver turned his face away. He wouldn't watch them enter. He never did. A eunuch appeared, dressed in indigo robes with stiff shoulders and white gloves. He didn't speak. He only raised one hand, then turned his back and walked inside. They followed. As instructed during the journey, the sound of sandals on stone echoed like dripping water into a deep well. The moment they crossed the gate, the air changed. It was warmer, heavier. The smell of pine resin and boiled herbs crept into their lungs. Another eunuch waited, this one younger, holding a scroll. One by one. Each girl was called by the name she had been given on paper, not the one her mother had whispered at night. Leja was now candidate 47. She was led down a corridor lined with pale lanterns and up a staircase into a white-tiled room that smelled of lye and mildew. A bath waited, lukewarm and steaming faintly. 3 attendants stripped her robe without speaking. Cold hands gripped her arms, guided her into the tub. They scrubbed her skin until it reddened. They combed her hair with a bone-toothed rake when they found a small mole near her hip. One maid whispered something under her breath and nodded. Leger didn't ask what it meant. When they were done, they dressed her in a pale blue robe with a stitched number on the chest. Her hair was wrapped in a damp cloth. She was told to wait in silence. No words, no questions, no tears. The examination came next. She was led behind a curtain where 3 eunuchs stood beside a low table covered in scrolls. She was told to open her mouth, to turn her head left, then right, to raise her arms, to lie back. Gloved fingers pressed into her stomach, traced her ribs, parted her lips. She was measured not for clothing, but for symmetry. Her wrists, her ankles, her calves, the color of her teeth, the smell of her breath. She was not a person. She was data, a specimen. Back in the dormitory, her new roommates did not speak to her. They sat quietly, brushing hair, folding linens, counting rice grains. The room held 10 beds, wooden planks with straw mats. No pillows. One narrow window let in a sliver of daylight. Outside, she could hear the rustle of wind through pine trees, the occasional clatter of ceramic bowls, but never voices. That night, Lejeune dreamt of fish drying in the sun, of her mother humming while gutting carp. When she woke, the girl in the bed beside hers was gone. No one acknowledged it. The bed was stripped. A new mat was brought in. Routine resumed. Each day, they trained, not in reading or writing, but in disappearance. They were taught to walk without sound, to breathe without lifting their chests, to bow at precise angles, to turn corners without brushing against fabric. They were taught where to place their eyes, never too high, never too low, never in defiance. By the 3rd week, Leray knew how to fold her hands like an offering. She knew how to kneel without pain, how to smile without joy. She could feel when a guard was nearby, just from the shift in air. She did not speak to anyone. She didn't need to. Words had no function in this place. Orders were gestures. Warnings were glances. Punishments were silence. Late one night, a girl screamed, short, sharp, then nothing. The next morning, her shoes were still by the door. No one moved them. No one touched them. Legia began to wonder if she had imagined the sound. Time passed without count. There were no clocks, no calendars. Meals came twice a day: plain rice, a slice of turnip, sometimes boiled chicken feet. The girls were never allowed to eat together. They sat in silence, facing opposite corners of the room. One morning, a name was read aloud: 47. Legia stood. Her feet were bare, her robe stiff with starch. A eunuch waited at the door, silver tray in hand. On it, a carved wooden plaque with her number. She followed him through a different corridor, one she had never seen. The walls here were redder, the lanterns lower, the silence deeper. They arrived at a chamber with no windows. 3 maids stripped her again, bathed her again, dressed her in yellow silk, this time thinner than before. Her arms were wrapped in layers, her legs bound loosely. She could walk, but only in small steps. The eunuch handed her a satin pillow. She carried it like a newborn. No one told her where she was going. She knew. The air grew warmer as they passed through the final hallway. The scent of sandalwood and musk thickened. Every 10 steps, a guard. Every 20. A painted panel of dragons chasing the sun. At last, a pair of carved doors opened. Inside, velvet, silk, shadows. A bed large enough to bury a person in. Drapes heavy enough to silence breathing. And waiting at its edge, an emptiness more frightening than presence. She was guided forward, then told to kneel. She dropped and began to crawl. The carpet beneath her knees was so thick she couldn't feel the cold stone underneath. Her palms pressed into its surface, and her elbows trembled. Though not from exhaustion, it was the silence that unsteadied her. A silence so vast it swallowed breath and thought alike. She crawled forward slowly. Each movement had to be exact. Not too fast, not too slow, not too loud. She had been told nothing, but she had seen enough to understand that even in obedience. There were rules, unspoken, invisible but absolute. The air grew warmer with every inch she crossed. Curtains surrounded the chamber, tall and layered, embroidered with golden dragons and clouds. Their threads caught the candlelight, flickering like fire trapped in fabric. She could hear no breathing but her own. And even that. She tried to silence. She kept her eyes fixed on the space just in front of her fingertips, never lifting her gaze. The platform bed was raised 3 feet off the floor. Its legs were carved with phoenix wings and tiger claws. A thin line of incense smoke drifted upward beside it. The scent was foreign musky, resinous, laced with something bitter. Her stomach turned, but she didn't stop. When she reached the foot of the bed, she paused. A hand, heavy and perfumed, gripped her shoulder and lifted her gently onto the sheets. She didn't see the face. She wasn't allowed to. Her eyes remained lowered, her body still. The yellow silk binding her limbs made movement difficult. That, too, was by design. No words were exchanged. No names. No instructions. Only ritual. Afterward, she was carried back, not in the litter this time, but over a shoulder, like an object wrapped for safekeeping. She was laid on a mat in a side chamber with no window and no door, only a curtain. The silk stuck to her skin. Her breath came in gasps. Though she had not run, her mind didn't race. It simply disconnected, as if her thoughts had decided to wait somewhere else for a while. At dawn, she was led back to her quarters. Room 17 had not changed. The girls still sat on their mats. No one looked at her, not with jealousy, not with curiosity, not even with recognition. She was simply a version of what they feared they would become. For the next 4 nights, the same eunuch appeared after sundown. The tray, the robe, the crawl. Each time, she felt her body vanish further into something distant, something she couldn't retrieve even if she tried. Her name no longer echoed in her mind, only the number remained. 47. Then, on the 5th night, everything changed. She was no longer returned to room 17. She was taken to a separate building tucked behind the eastern gardens. The pathway to it was paved with river stones, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. Red lanterns lined the corridor, each bearing a different animal in gold ink. None of them were lions or cranes. These creatures had sharper teeth, darker eyes. Inside the compound, she was assigned her own room, a chamber with a canopy bed, lacquered wardrobe, and 2 maids who bowed but never spoke unless spoken to. The bedding smelled of rose petals soaked in rice wine. Her meals were richer now, white fish in ginger broth, duck glazed with plum, rice steamed with lotus leaves. Her robes changed from blue to soft jade, then to amber. Her new name was spoken for the first time on the 7th morning, Trin Tiep Dung. It came from the lips of an older maid with clouded eyes and a voice like dried leaves. She pronounced it without emotion, placing the embroidered sash across a lacquer tray, as though announcing a station rather than a person in this new life. Silence followed her like a second shadow. No one discussed the summons. No one questioned the bindings. No one mentioned the crawling. Her new attendants prepared her each evening with mechanical precision, hair pinned, skin powdered, wrists wrapped, steps shortened. Each night was a mirror of the last. But with each visit, her body betrayed her in new ways. Her muscles ached differently. Her breath came shallower. Her heartbeat dulled. The first time she bled after a summons, she thought it was her cycle. The second time, she realized it wasn't. One morning, she collapsed while standing. No one gasped. No one cried. The nearest maid simply knelt beside her, loosened her robe, and poured a spoonful of broth into her mouth. She didn't ask what had happened. Trin Tiep Dung didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Some nights, the visits came earlier. Others, later. Once, she was summoned after midnight. Another time, she wasn't summoned at all for 3 days. The unpredictability became the only constant. On the 12th night, she was woken by a sound she hadn't heard before. A name whispered in the next room. Not a number, a name. She held her breath and leaned closer to the wall. It was Tuong Dao. She hadn't seen her since the first week in room 17. She had assumed she'd been dismissed or worse. The voice beyond the wall was shaking. Frantic. Another voice. Calm and cold. Responded. She couldn't make out the words. Only the rhythm. Then a sharp sound, a gasp, followed by silence. She didn't sleep after that. The next day, she asked her maid what had happened to the girl in the next chamber. The maid blinked slowly, folded a towel, and answered in a tone as flat as stone. There is no next chamber. 3 nights later, Trin Tiep Dung awoke in her bed, her sheets wet with blood. No pain, just blood. And cold. So much cold. A eunuch was summoned. She was carried again not to the central court, but to a small room near the infirmary, where no lamps were lit and no incense burned. A woman with silver hair examined her without expression. No herbs were given. No prayers were offered. Only cloth. Only silence. By morning, she was back in her bed. The sheets had been changed. Her robe was of fresh ivory. Nothing was said. She ate breakfast in silence. No one came for her that night, or the night after. She had become invisible again. But this time, not by training. This time, by choice. Her breath had become shallow, not from sickness, but from the habit of holding it. Trin Tiep Dung had learned that silence wasn't just a rule, it was a weapon. The less she said, the less they saw, and if they saw less. She survived longer. The bleeding stopped after 4 days. What remained was a slow, dull ache beneath her ribs, like a reminder carved from within. No one asked how she felt. The doctor never returned. The old maid resumed her daily tasks as though nothing had happened. Soup was served at the same time. Baths were drawn with the same water temperature. Her hair was braided in the same tight pattern that left her scalp tender for hours. Then came the summons again. It was almost absurd. The way the rituals resumed, as if her absence had been no more than a clerical error. The same yellow robe, the same binding, the same long hallway lined with flickering lanterns. She crawled again. The bed waited in its silence. After that night, something shifted inside her. She could feel it. A nausea not tied to food. A tremor not born of fear. Her skin flushed randomly. Her appetite disappeared. Her sleep became fragile. She waited 10 days, then counted back. Her cycle had not come. When she reported it, the reaction was immediate. A eunuch arrived before the hour had changed. 2 maids packed her robes. Her meals were doubled. Her bedding was replaced with new silk sheets embroidered with peonies. The silence around her deepened. Not the neglectful kind, this was reverent. Purposeful. She was moved once more. This time, to a building deep within the inner court, far from the main paths. It had no external windows, only slits above the doors for air. The floors were carpeted in velvet. The walls bore painted screens of cranes, bamboo, and crescent moons. This was the maternity ward, though no one called it that. Inside, 4 other women lived in separate rooms. They never saw one another. Their footsteps were staggered. Meals were delivered in covered trays by gloved attendants. There were no voices, no names, only movement behind paper screens and the faint rustling of silk at odd hours. Pregnancy was both protection and peril. She was no longer summoned at night. Her body became sacred, watched, measured, guarded. But the scrutiny came with its own violence. Every morning, she was examined, her belly measured, her pulse counted, her urine inspected for color, her chest touched to check for tenderness, her breath listened to for irregularity. And the questions, not spoken aloud, but written on slips of paper that were burned after reading. Do you feel movement? Any blood? Do you dream of fire or water? She did not understand that last question. By the 3rd month, the swelling became visible. Her hips ached, her ankles retained water, her breasts darkened sometimes. She sat with both hands over her stomach, not out of joy, but out of a strange, unfamiliar fear, one that clung to her ribs and whispered something she couldn't name. Then came the threats. Not declared, not spoken, just patterns that revealed themselves like footprints in wet soil. The door to her chamber was now locked from the outside. The maid who used to braid her hair was replaced by a younger one who never made eye contact. Her meals were taste-tested in front of her. Her tea poured from a new pot each time. Every corner of her room was swept twice a day. And once, she found a crushed lotus pod hidden under her pillow, a symbol she did not recognize, but which made the older doctor blanch when he saw it. She was not the only one watching her belly grow. Others were watching, too. Someone tried to poison her. It wasn't confirmed. There was no investigation, no accusations. But her maid was replaced again, and the physician no longer let the tea cool before sampling it himself. She was told nothing, but everything was said through movement, through eyes that glanced too quickly, through silences that lasted a second too long. She asked to see the stars once. The maid looked at her as if she had spoken a forbidden word. There were no stars in the maternity wing, only the ceiling painted with clouds, only lamps that never fully dimmed, only dreams that burned and flickered and disappeared before she could name them. On the 7th month, she was escorted to a birthing chamber, not because it was time, but because they wanted her ready. The room was larger than her cell, with stone floors and ropes hanging from the ceiling beams. The walls bore no decoration. A narrow cot sat in the middle, lined with dark linen. There were tools on a tray, knives, towels, weights. She was shown where she would squat, how to brace herself, when to breathe. The midwife said nothing. Her hands were rough, her eyes dry. Back in her room, Trin Tiep Dung began to count the days not by meals, but by how loud her bones sounded in the silence. The baby kicked more now, a strange fluttering that shifted into pressure. Her spine ached, her fingers swelled. Some nights, she couldn't sleep unless she lay flat on the cold floor. Then one night, she felt the water break. There was no time for panic. The door opened without knocking. She was lifted, carried. The pain began before she could speak. Each contraction came like a wave, hot, sharp, drowning. Her vision blurred. She heard voices but couldn't understand them. She was placed on the cot, hands pressed against her belly. Someone told her to push, then again, then again. The baby emerged just before sunrise. A boy. She saw him for 3 heartbeats. Then he was taken. Wrapped in silk, carried away by arms that did not shake. She reached out once. Not with hope, not with desire. Just reflex. Her hand was pushed down gently. "You may rest now," a voice said. But she never did. The morning after the birth, the room was stripped clean. The linen was gone. The rope bindings removed. Even the air felt emptied, as if the cries that had echoed there hours earlier had been collected and buried somewhere far beneath the stone floor. Trin Tiep Dung lay still on a fresh mat. Her legs ached. Her abdomen throbbed with a slow, deep soreness. A pale cloth had been wrapped around her waist and hips, tied tightly to press her body back into its old shape. Her breasts were swollen and hot, her pulse fragile and uneven. Every breath made her ribs sting. But it was not pain that held her motionless. It was silence. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her. The midwife returned once to check her bleeding and left without a word. Her food was brought in smaller portions. Her tea remained untouched on the tray. Her body, once guarded like treasure, now seemed invisible again. The boy was never brought back. She had seen him for 3 seconds, skin the color of pale rice, lips pursed into a silent cry, a hand that twitched toward the light. Then silk wrapped him, and he disappeared through a door she wasn't allowed to name. She was told nothing, but the signs were everywhere. She was no longer in the maternity wing. She had been moved to a quieter compound behind the eastern wall. The windows were small, the floors unpolished. Her room had no mirror. The bedding was plain. The walls were bare. The door creaked when it opened and groaned when it closed. Her meals came late. Her questions were unanswered. The maid assigned to her had been replaced again. Once during a bath, she asked the girl if the baby was alive. The girl dipped the cloth into the water, wrung it out carefully, and said, without emotion, "Yes." No name, no location, no certainty. Just, yes. Later that evening, a scroll was placed at her bedside. It was rolled tightly, sealed with wax. The emblem on the seal was unfamiliar. Inside was a single sentence, written in red ink. "The child will be raised in accordance with his station." That was the only acknowledgement she ever received. She was forbidden from asking again. Weeks passed in rhythmless silence. Her body recovered. Her breasts stopped aching. Her cycle returned, irregular at first, then normal. Her hair grew longer. The bindings around her abdomen were removed. She began to walk without help. The muscle returned to her legs. Her appetite came back, but her hunger never did. One morning, the maid brought her a brush and a copper mirror. The mirror was dull, the brush missing 3 bristles. No explanation was given, but she understood the gesture. She was expected to appear again, not to be chosen, but to be present. That evening, she was summoned, not to the emperor, but to the inner garden for a seasonal rite. Her name was called along with 9 others, all former consorts, all mothers. They stood in a line along the outer path of the garden. None were allowed to speak. Each wore pale green silk, embroidered only with plum blossoms. The ritual itself was brief an offering of incense. a reading of an edict none of them could hear. But it marked something. They were visible again, but not as women, as vessels. She was not brought back to her old quarters. Instead, she was moved once more to a wing reserved for retired concubines. They called it the Quiet Hall. It had no guards, no schedules, no restrictions. The doors remained unlocked. The corridors were dim and drafty. Each woman had her own cell. They could speak if they wished, though most did not. The Quiet Hall was where they kept the forgotten, where voices went to fade. She met others there, some older, some younger. Some had given birth to sons now serving in distant provinces. Others had lost children to fever or edicts. A few spoke of girls taken from their arms at birth and married off before their mothers ever knew their faces. One woman, frail and nearly blind, whispered in the dark that she had borne 3 sons. Only one survived. She never knew which. The others listened, but no one cried. There were no tears left in that place, only breath. Shallow and short, only shadows and the rustle of silk on stone. Once, while sitting beneath a lattice window, Trin Teep Dung saw a boy pass by with 2 tutors in gold-trimmed robes. He was perhaps 6 or 7, tall for his age, with hair coiled into the formal knot of Imperial children. His face passed through the sunlight just long enough for her to see the shape of his jaw, the set of his mouth. It might have been him, or not. She did not move. A week later, she received a robe with silver thread, a mark of recognition. It allowed her to walk the garden paths for 15 minutes each morning. But she never looked beyond the bamboo hedges. The world outside no longer held her name. Years passed without seasons. The older women died, one by one, their bodies wrapped in white linen, carried through side doors before dawn. New faces arrived young, frightened, silent. None stayed long. They either rose or vanished. Her breasts no longer held milk, her waist no longer curved, her hair thinned and grayed, her fingers curled slightly from the cold, but her back remained straight, her steps remained steady. One night, a storm cracked across the tiled roof, and she woke with a gasp. For a moment, she thought she had heard the cry of a baby again, but it was only wind pushing through broken shutters. She wrapped herself in her old robe and sat on the stone bench by the door. The sky above was black. The stars did not show, and she knew, for the first time, that the child she bore was no longer hers, had never been hers. She had not given birth to a son. She had given him to the throne, and the throne did not remember. Years had begun to collapse into one another. Time no longer arrived in seasons, only in the aching joints, the graying hair, the way fabric took longer to dry in winter, in the quiet hall. Days passed without event. Conversations were brief, if they occurred at all. The women had stopped telling stories. They no longer marked birthdays or names or numbers. Even memories were spoken of with hesitation, as though they belonged to someone else now. Trin Teep Dung had learned not to listen for her name. It had not been spoken aloud in over a decade. The attendants who passed through her wing were younger than the robe she wore. She could feel their eyes, polite and distant. To them, she was not a woman, not even a mother, just one of the old ones, a remnant of another reign. One morning, as she rose from her mat and folded it neatly beside the wall, a maid arrived with a letter, not a scroll, a letter, folded in half, sealed with a ribbon of gray silk. It bore no name, only a mark in the upper corner, a crescent moon, flanked by 2 brushstrokes like wings. She stared at it for several moments before reaching out. Inside were 6 characters. They were written in delicate strokes, the ink slightly smudged in places. Your son begins his tutelage. No location, no signature, no instruction. She held the paper for hours, unsure if she had read it correctly. The words did not feel like a gift. They didn't open anything. They closed it, quietly. It meant he had reached the age of study, that he would learn the histories, the rituals, the art of ruling, and that she would never see him again. She folded the letter and placed it inside her sleeve. She did not weep. There was nothing left in her body to push forward into tears. Her stomach had long forgotten the shape of hunger. Her eyes had dried into a patient gaze. The next day, she walked the garden path again. The trees were bare, but the wind smelled of pine. She stopped beneath the stone pavilion and pressed her palm to one of the carved beams. The wood was cold. She stood there longer than usual. The maid did not rush her. That evening, as she sat by the small lantern in her room, she picked up the calligraphy brush. Her fingers had grown stiff, and the ink bled too quickly into the paper. Her handwriting no longer resembled what it had been. Still, she wrote only one sentence. I was once called, and that name was mine. She did not sign it. She folded the paper, placed it beneath the mat, and laid down without blowing out the light. The next morning, she was still breathing. The letter was still there. Life had not changed. The sky remained gray. Her meals remained plain. But now, something inside her had shifted. She began rising earlier than the attendants. Before the call for breakfast, before the incense smoke, she would walk the corridor in silence, touching the wall with her fingertips, not searching for something, just acknowledging that she still had a body, that it still moved, that it still left traces. She spoke to no one. She watched the new faces arrive, girls with fearful eyes, bodies thin from fasting. They bowed too quickly. They stepped too loudly. They carried themselves like birds too fragile to fly. One of them reminded her of Tuongdao, not in appearance, but in silence. The girl was assigned to a chamber across from hers, young, straight-backed, her eyes heavy with sleep she could not find. One night, Trin Tip Dung left a dried plum wrapped in cloth at the girl's door. Nothing was said. The next morning, it was gone. 2 nights later. The girl left a folded paper in return. No words, just a flower pressed flat between 2 pages. A camellia. They never spoke. They never looked at each other directly. But something had passed between them. Something outside ritual. Outside law. Months passed. One evening, thunder rolled across the rooftops. Rain fell hard against the window slats. The garden flooded, and the wind howled through broken seams in the wooden eaves. Trin Tip Dung sat by her lantern again, but this time she did not write. She only listened. It was during that storm that something strange occurred. A eunuch entered the hall past curfew, his face pale, his robes wet. He carried a bundle wrapped in red. He walked straight to the end of the corridor, paused, turned, then walked back the way he came. No one questioned him. No doors opened. No sounds followed. But everyone saw, after that night, the girl across the hall was gone. Her mat removed, her robes collected, her slippers left at the base of the step, untouched. Trin Tip Dung did not ask. She had once been that girl. Now she was only a witness. The seasons changed again. Leaves returned to the plum trees. Lanterns were rehung with fresh oil. The air warmed. The quiet hall received a new coat of whitewash. But the faces grew fewer. The corridors quieter. A generation was fading. One morning, while trimming her nails, she noticed the joints of her fingers had stiffened further. She could no longer close her hands into fists. Her grip had weakened. Her writing brush dropped twice that day. She did not try again. That night, she walked into the courtyard alone. The moon was full. Low in the sky, the tiles were slick from dew. She sat on the bench by the camellia bush and looked at the sky until her eyes watered. There were stars, hundreds of them. She whispered a name, not his, not hers, just something soft enough for the leaves to hold. Then she stood. She walked back to her room, lit a small candle, and closed the door. By the time the walls trembled with change, Trin Tiep Dung could no longer hear clearly. The drums were distant. The voices of the younger attendants blurred like wind moving through cloth. Her body moved more slowly, her joints thick with stiffness. But her mind remained lucid. It was the silence she trusted most. The guards no longer held their spears with certainty. They stood in pairs now, speaking in hushed tones, watching the sky more often than the corridors. The rhythm of the palace had fractured. Orders came late. Names were called without ceremony. Some doors were left open at night. Whispers spread before announcements. It was how she learned the dynasty had ended. The emperor was no longer on the throne, not deposed, not killed, simply removed, like a portrait taken down in the dark. The court dissolved quietly. No horns, no mourning banners. Just a long, soft breath, leaving a room that had waited too long to exhale. She remained in the quiet hall. No one came for her. No one dismissed her. She had become part of the structure itself. One of the hidden lines in the wood grain, a fixture among fading tapestries. Outside the walls, the world rearranged itself. Armies marched beneath flags she'd never seen. Streets changed their names. Markets were rebuilt. Temples reopened. Families reunited. Inside, the schedule collapsed. Meals were missed. Supplies delayed. The water in her basin ran cold for a week. One evening, a mouse wandered into her room and sat near the candle. She did not move. It stayed until the flame died. Then, one morning, the doors of the palace opened. No order, no summons, no horns. They simply opened. Servants walked out. Slowly at first, then in groups. Some cried. Some clutched bundles of cloth, documents, keepsakes. A few ran. Most did not look back. Trin Tiep Dung stayed in her chamber until the sun reached the floorboards. She stood, dressed slowly, and walked to the edge of the corridor. The hallway was empty. Her footsteps echoed. Outside, the garden gates were unlocked. The trees swayed. Plum blossoms had fallen across the stone path like pale confetti. She stepped beyond the threshold, each movement measured, as though gravity had changed. She passed the camellia bush. It had withered at the edges. By the pavilion, she paused. There were no guards, no maids, no records, no one to tell her what to do. She sat. A woman from another wing passed by, a linen sack slung over her shoulder. Their eyes met briefly. Then she continued on. Trin Tiep Dung remained under the pavilion until the light began to bend. She did not expect anyone to call her name. No one had for years. That evening, a child passed through the outer courtyard. He was perhaps 10, dressed in civilian cotton. He glanced toward the stone benches where the elders sometimes sat. His expression was unreadable. He did not speak. His eyes caught hers for only a moment, then shifted away, as if afraid of what recognition might bring. It was not her son, or perhaps it was. It no longer mattered. She returned to her room that night. There was no supper waiting. The bed had been stripped. Her robe hung on the hook beside the door. The scroll she had written years before still rested beneath her mat. The ink had faded to a soft rust color. She lay down fully clothed, one arm resting across her abdomen, her hand no longer curved with strength. Her breath was thin. Sometime during the night, the oil in the lamp burned out. No one came to check. At sunrise, a low wind stirred the corridor. Dust lifted from the corners. A bird called once and then fell quiet. By midday, the attendants from the outer compound arrived to clear the remaining rooms. They did not recognize her. They paused only long enough to cover her body with a cloth, then moved on to the next door. She was not given a ceremony. No incense. No name carved. Her body was taken to the service quarters. Her belongings, 2 robes, a wooden comb. The faded scroll were folded and placed in a box that would be buried beneath a magnolia tree behind the kitchens. No one in the new administration would know who she had been. Not a consort. Not a mother. Not even a woman once chosen. Just another unnamed shadow left behind by a history that had run out of memory. But the walls remembered. The floor still held her footsteps, and beneath the garden pavilion, where the camellia had dropped its last petal, the stone still held the warmth of the night she had last whispered her name.